It took more than 800 Dakotas to ferry 23,000 Allied paratroopers to Normandy. Today, in the most ambitious part of the commemorations, the exercise was repeated. True, on a smaller scale, 22 of the aircraft setting off from Duxford with hundreds aboard, a feat that required bringing together surviving planes from across the world and readying them to fly in formation.
It just proves how massive an undertaking it was. You know, we started planning this 3 years ago and it was a really good idea then, and 2 years ago it was a good idea. 6 months ago we started to realise exactly what we had taken on, and it's been a lot of very, very hard work by a lot of people. But to try and multiply that 20, 30 times, it's just mind-blowing.
It was the organisation of this colossal operation on sea, land and air that was to mark it as the biggest beach assault in history. There was nothing inevitable about the success of D-Day. For a long time, the British and Americans argued about whether the whole idea was even worth trying. And even once they'd agreed, a victory was never certain. Churchill wanted to prioritise the Mediterranean campaign, and late in 1943 wrote to President Roosevelt casting doubt over whether D-Day should happen in 1944 at all.
If we make serious mistakes in the campaign of 1944, we might give Hitler the chance of a startling comeback.
He was persuaded by the Americans to do it, Eisenhower noting of Churchill that in May 1944 Winston had
finally, at this late date, come to believe with the rest of us that this was the true course of action in order to achieve the victory.
But British worries persisted, even as the invasion force set out 75 years ago tonight. Field Marshal Allan Brooke wrote in his diary,
"I am very uneasy about the whole operation. It may well be the most ghastly disaster of the whole war."
There was a fundamental contradiction between American and British view of strategy. Churchill, very much like his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and going back really to the 18th century, felt that the traditional British strategy was essentially a maritime one, that you should wear down the enemy in the Mediterranean before, with coalition warfare, you took him on the continent of Europe.
When I go out, I want to squat.
Today, we joined some of the Americans as they practice their drills for the drop.
How many seconds is it easy?
These men are all veterans of the US Armed Forces who've travelled here to recreate the World War II jump and value their partnership with the Brits.
And it's going to happen fast, man.
What's it like working with the Brits?
Oh, they're great. They're great. They're a lot of fun, jolly guys. Always good to give you a little bit of a hard time in a fun way, and we try and give it back as well. But we have a great relationship with the Brits, always have.
Back in 1944, the relief of achieving the landing successfully was followed by frustration at slow progress through the Normandy hedgerows and backbiting between British and American generals who came from quite different cultures. American and British military chiefs often regarded one another with suspicion. The chief of the Imperial General Staff called Eisenhower
a hopeless commander,
and wrote of his opposite number in Washington,
"I do not believe that he has any strategic vision whatsoever."
For their part, the US Joint Chiefs noted sourly after Churchill agreed to go along with D-Day that the British
are traditionally expert at meeting the letter while avoiding the spirit of commitments.
I think in general terms you can say that the British were rather cagier in their approach than the Americans. We the British had been fighting for 4 years at this stage. The Americans had not come into fighting the Germans until the end of 1942. And so they still, with a very bullish, perhaps, way of looking at the problem, the direct approach, came up against the British experience of many a bloody nose. And look, we've got to pace this out perhaps a little more. And perhaps national characteristics play into that to a certain extent.
In the end, it was Eisenhower's skill as a diplomat rather than a field commander that was central to holding the Allied effort together. In the clashes between generals after D-Day, it was the American Supreme Commander who prevented more damaging public recriminations. After American setbacks at the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery tried to gain control over all ground forces. Eisenhower slapped him down.
You disturb me with predictions of failure unless your exact opinions are met.
But ultimately, he didn't sack Monty or the more anti-British US Army generals, telling one of his staff,
"If I can keep a team together, anything's worth it."
I think, though, when it came to Eisenhower, both Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke and Montgomery used to make remarks. Certainly Monty would sort of say, you know, nice chap, no soldier. They all agreed that he was a very nice fellow and so forth. What they, I think, underestimated him on was, A, his ability to keep a very difficult coalition together, and some very difficult characters. When you think of Bradley was not easy. I mean, he was often seen to be very amenable, but actually he loathed Montgomery. And Patton, of course, was a famous loose cannon. But the way Eisenhower kept them together was extremely effective.
As today's commemoration was taking shape, aircraft from the US Air Force Special Operations Forces flew by the Duxford Aerodrome, an eloquent demonstration of the power at America's disposal. Of course, none of this would have happened without American military and industrial might, and those asymmetries of power were well understood even in 1944 and have only grown with the passing of the decades. As the paratroopers set off for today's drop, they were watched by Ronald Steer, who jumped a few months later during the Rhine crossing operation of 1945, and still thinks of those who fell before war's end.
Oh, it's brilliant remembering these occasions. The only trouble with me personally, I get very emotional thinking about what happened to my mates.
Today was an opportunity to remember not just sacrifice, but the effort required to bring about such complex undertakings. Compromise was central to it, as was a sense that delivering thousands of troops to northern France by air was just one example of the industrial and political heft that could only be provided by America.